everyone. Welcome back to Living Landscapes, the podcast for the Center for Community and Environmental Design at Purdue University. I am your host, Ishraq Awashra. Today, we are so honored to talk to Clay Gruber, who is a designer, a landscape architect, a founder of Clay Gruber Design in Philadelphia, and also a part of Rural Future Collaborative. Thank you so much, Clay, for being here with us. It's an honor for the Center for Community and Environmental Design to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Really nice to be with you. Excited
Thank
to
you.
talk.
Thank you. So before I start with talking a little bit about your work as a landscape architect and also maybe some of your research currently and previously, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up being a designer?
Sure, sure. So right now I'm talking to you located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania,
Uh-huh.
which is quite a ways from home. I grew up in a really small rural town called Joliet in south central Montana. Um, Primarily a agricultural town, kind of classic, no stop lights, no fast food chains. Out in the middle of what has now become a part of the country that's been a gold rush of attention and land grab by a lot of wealthier people leaving urban communities primarily in California and Colorado,
Mhm.
trying to kind of go to Montana to be have a higher quality of life, being nature, kind of taking advantage of some of the low property values there that have historically been there until the recent years. But as mentioned, I grew up, on a cattle ranch. In this small community that had kind of stayed still for, probably 50 years.
Mhm.
Um, my upbringing was quite agrarian. I'm a sixth generation cattle rancher in Montana. So my family were some of the early homesteaders there. Um, and we had that distinct, really Western cowboy culture upbringing. My brother's rodeoed through high school and college, and into the pros. I Yeah, just a very kind of standard rural upbringing,
Yeah.
um, that you don't realize is quite unique until you come
Mhm.
to an urban place. So I left after my under high school to do undergraduate school at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, which is quite a turnaround from Joliet. And what I really realized there, I went there actually to study natural resource conservation because
Mhm.
probably what made the most sense with my upbringing was something embedded in nature and the natural sciences.
Mhm.
But when I got to Vancouver, I was really taken aback by how fascinating a multicultural urban environment was.
Yeah.
And I switched actually to sociology
Mhm.
because I ended up taking a course in that. And it started to explain this milieu of, cultural um, clash and adjacencies that was so absurdly different from my, quite homogenous rural upbringing.
Mhm.
So I studied that throughout my time at UBC, left, had some kind of odd jobs all over. In the meantime, I was a forest firefighter for the
Mhm.
U.S. Forest Service.
Mhm.
So I was out in nature, on wildfires in the summers, um, kind of in the middle of nowhere. But I was trying to figure out how you really combined more of a, interest in culture, sociology, and the humanities with something a little more tactile uh, and more embedded in making, which was my upbringing. So
Mhm.
architecture felt like the natural way to really combine those two
Yeah.
things. And um, I had that idea and I said, well, I've never taken an art course or anything in
Yeah.
my life.
Yeah.
So, so the only thing I could think of to get into college was to
Mhm.
build a cabin on my parents' ranch land. So
Oh.
I built like this really kind of cool, like little shaker modernist, $6,000 shack with all the money I had. That's still standing there today. And that was good enough for me to get into a program. So I ended up
Mm-hmm.
going to the University of Pennsylvania for a master's program.
Mm-hmm.
Never having really spent any time in the East Coast, just went with a bag. Um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, Landed in Philadelphia and was really taken aback by how much different the East Coast urban environment is from the West Coast.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but during my time at University of Pennsylvania in architecture, I kept kind of looking over to that landscape
Mm-hmm.
group. And they were dealing, while we were in the architecture department, dealing with a lot of things surrounding form and a lot of computational making.
Yeah.
The landscape department was doing something more tactile.
Yeah.
It felt more sensitive, more responsive to maybe the issues of people,
Mm-hmm.
wildlife, climate, all those good things that we talk about in the world of landscape architecture.
Yeah.
And it happened to be a wonderful program. So
Mm-hmm.
I ended up doing the dual degree,
Mm-hmm.
still thinking I would be a architect. And then I um, sat in on a conference at the University of Pennsylvania. And this was really the first time I had heard of landscape architecture entering the realm of agriculture. And it was totally fascinating. And one of the speakers there was Thomas Woltz of Nelson Bird Woltz Landscape Architect.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Knowing my background, one of my professors really pulled me aside and was like, "You need to meet Thomas Woltz." Um, he comes from, a similar background from you. He grew up on a farm in rural North Carolina. You
Mm-hmm.
two would have some things in common. So as the only really, ag kid in that program, I was, really excited. So I ended up talking to Thomas, and it really drew that connection in a way that I had never thought possible, that
Mm-hmm.
landscape architecture really does have a place in thinking about communities like the ones I'd come from.
Yeah.
Um, and not just, a lot of the urban issues that the profession has done a really great job of addressing over the last, 10 to 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that was great. And
Mm-hmm.
he Thomas basically pulled me aside and said, you're graduating in a year, you're going to come work for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I said, okay, I guess I don't have a choice in the matter. And I'm so glad he did, because I was able to spend the first 5 years of my career at Nelson Bird Woltz really learning with him and his amazing staff. There's a lot of talented designers there who are all kind of bought into the vision of that firm
Mm-hmm.
that Thomas has laid out, which is really that connection of culture and ecology. So during my time there, I was able to work on some really, dream projects, really.
Yeah.
And those projects often dealt with, a client that might have be in the position to afford um, for a designer to come in and
Mm-hmm.
take a chance on us to think about how to we could impact their land and the way that they use it
Mm-hmm.
in ways outside of just aesthetics.
Yeah.
Um, and that was really wonderful, because what you come to realize is, where are the ways in which landscape architects actually can
Yeah.
get into the agricultural community, and you're the same as me. We coming from multi-generational agricultural families,
Yeah.
even knowing the impact, the tool set of landscape architects,
Mm-hmm.
you kind of go, you know if I told my dad to hire a landscape architect, he would say, that's a cute idea, but
Yeah.
no, I'm not going to.
Yeah.
And that really comes down to a bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an economic component to that, but there's also very few instances
Yeah.
of case studies of
Mm-hmm.
of how that's a good return on investment for a landowner. So that's one thing that I think was super fascinating about that
Yeah.
time was like what it was by having the opportunity to work with some of the clients I did,
Mm-hmm.
Nelson Bird Woltz, it really made you realize what that there actually is a return on investment
Yeah.
for having the design community come into those spaces and come into
Mm-hmm.
clients. And I think um, one of the things I really appreciated about MBW's approach was I think we're seeing, and I would love your perspective on this. One of the areas that I have seen landscape architects find
Mm-hmm.
their way into agricultural communities and agricultural discussions is through the public sector, through
Yeah.
things like USDA funded grants,
Yeah.
through land grant college funding,
Mm-hmm.
to do some of the wonderful research that, probably you and your colleagues are doing at Purdue and elsewhere around the country.
Mm-hmm.
But what MBW did really well was to say, um, Thomas would often lead a lot of his lectures by saying, I think it's something like two-thirds of the United States is in private land ownership.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so even if we can make impact on public lands, we're really only scratching the surface of
Yeah.
where our toolkit can start to contribute to
Yeah.
bigger issues of soil health, soil regeneration, ecological restoration, climate,
Mm-hmm.
biodiversity enhancement, and something that's near and dear to my heart, which is rural economic development and the
Yeah.
communities like mine, how they can thrive in the 21st century, which right now seems to be quite threatened and really unclear. I'll pin that real quick and just move on to myself. In the last year, well, I should say in the last 4 or 5 years, collaborated with two colleagues from University of Pennsylvania to start
Mm-hmm.
Rural Futures Collaborative to try to expand that conversation about how practitioners can enter communities,
Mm-hmm.
rural communities in the conversation around agriculture and
Yeah.
conservation. So that's been one thing I've been doing, but um, and we could get into that. But I've been fortunate enough to have the opportunity to go out on my own as a solo practitioner in
Mm-hmm.
the basically since last fall. And I have a couple clients who are supporting that effort with a few jobs and hoping to really, expand that more into the realm of the conversation we're having today. So
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was a very long description of my life, but
Well, because it's full of, so many interesting things. And I keep thinking how you actually, left your small town to study sociology and then you ended up designing. But I feel like all the topics that you address really come from your background and like you being in a farm, but also you being in like a nice nature and then studying sociology. And soon we will talk about some of your writings and like maybe talking about your adaptive lands framework that's really blending all these topics together. So I think it's really cool and maybe exciting for younger generation landscape architects and people who just started college and coming from a small town to hear your story. It's very inspiring. Thanks for sharing.
yeah, of course.
So you were talking about your amazing work with NBW, and you say that Thomas Waltz will always say that two-thirds of the land is actually private property. And then when I also was checking the website of Rural Future Collaborative, I saw that you're saying that an overwhelming proportion of the United States, 97% of its land area, remains largely absent from the discussions of landscape architecture. And I'm not really quoting as is, I'm changing a little bit here.
Mhm.
But you were talking about how landscape architects really have agency in different lands, especially in urban areas, but the majority of the land in the US, and I can also like expand this and say in the world are actually rural and agriculture, but they're very absent from the design discussions. So, why is it important to address these topics? Why do we need to talk about agricultural areas and rural areas as designers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what it would come down to for me,
Hmm.
um, it's self-serving a little bit. You go, hey, this is my profession. I want to impact these places that I feel, connected to and feel agency over. So that's where it starts from. But as we grow as a profession,
Hmm.
you just realize that the toolkit of landscape architects
Hmm.
is is really exceptional for dealing with the issues of that 97% of America
Yeah.
um, that you bring up. So it's more to me, there's a lot of people who can move the needle in rural places,
Hmm.
but what our profession has done really well is to use design thinking in a way that is specific to land issues
Hmm.
and the human interface with land issues and the other inhabitants of that land, i.e., wildlife and fowl. And so our basic toolkit, right, of analyzing
Hmm.
topography, hydrology, natural ecosystems, community dynamics,
Hmm.
both human and non-human,
Hmm.
adjacencies, thinking of programmatic elements that can unlock something that adds value and quality of life to those inhabitants, both human and non-human.
Hmm.
Um, there's just no other profession like it that
Yeah.
does that. And only way it really works well in urban areas and why it's so urban focused is because there's the money
Hmm.
in it, and because the we started with the kind of humble means of doing land like backyards and estates and things like that. So we've proven our value and found an economic hold in urban and suburban areas.
Yeah.
Now, in rural areas, that kind of money and um, reference point for landowners dries up a little, right?
Hmm.
So really, it is not necessarily that we don't have value in those places. It's just we haven't necessarily proven our value and found those ways in which we, like I said, help a landowner get their return on value.
Yeah.
Um, One thing I talk about with my clients is, once you build a home, it automatically depreciates. The investment in your landscape is the only thing that appreciates coming from the design
Hmm.
community.
Yeah.
Um, and how that appreciates on estate land that might just have real estate value is different than how that appreciates on agricultural land that has a return on value through crops and yield and long-term thinking. So, yeah, I think for me, that's where I start to just realize that that toolkit that we have is exceptionally unique, and our mandate, I think, our generation of designers, which I would put you and I in that category, young people who are in school or just coming out of school. I
Hmm.
think this is going to be our push to figure out how we unlock
Yeah.
um, that 97%
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
the country.
Yeah, yeah. Can you now tell me a little bit about your framework that you published on the Rural Futures Collaborative, and your framework is called Adaptive Lands Framework, and we will actually have the link in the bio for people to check it out later.
Oh, great. Yeah, so the adaptive lands framework is essentially a communication tool
Hmm.
that I put together to really kind of explain uh, how feel landscape architects can find an entry point into working with design challenges around rural places. So what it is, as mentioned, I think, the profession is really wonderful at thinking through the dynamics of culture and ecology and how
Hmm.
those interact. And I think we've been as mentioned, as a very urban and suburban discipline, the issues of economics are usually just tied to budgets. So I get a client to do, their estate or their backyard or, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And usually, as far as the economic discussion goes, we're just talking about, what is your budget and how do we work the design within the budget? And there's a lot of, problem solving and getting clever about how to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
But when we're dealing with rural lands, the the main thing we're up against is the fact that the margins are so low in
Mm-hmm.
agriculture, particularly for family farmers and
Yeah.
ranchers and foresters. Um, and a lot of times that is really a big barrier in wanting to take a chance on a designer to come in and give you a design fee and, take you through an exercise that you may or may not use. That's usually just the non-starter
Yeah.
for people. So what the adaptive lands framework is an attempt to try to communicate and visualize with a
Mm-hmm.
client um, how different land-based techniques that we can employ on their land actually impact that economic question for them. So a big motivation for this came from my time with MBW and dealing with a region that had dealt with it was a forestry region that had dealt with a significant blow to its economy during the 2008 housing crash, where all of a sudden the kind of the lumber markets had dried up and really, really, the whole region is still recovering from it. So the question became, what is a way how could we design this land of landowners differently to where they can start to weather or be more resilient or anti-fragile or whatever term you want to use in the face of kind of extreme weather or market events.
Yeah.
um, so this tool started to unlock a way in which I can now talk to landowners to kind of almost build the mosaic of their property that will help them understand which area of the land should be put in profit, which should be put in conservation, where should you diversify your land use techniques, so that in the case of extreme economic or weather events, um, you can come out on the other side. And that's where I feel this framework is where that conversation with landowners started to really make sense, saying, oh, that's what a designer can bring to this, is
Mm-hmm.
this holistic thinking through the different ways of strategizing with them. So the executive lands framework, I won't go through it in full
Yeah.
full detail. I think it's just worth looking at on the website. But essentially, it's a four-quadrant graph: ecological loss versus ecological gains on the x-axis, and the y-axis is economic loss to economic gains.
Mm-hmm.
And within each quadrant, what we're able to do is show a landowner where they're at on that graph and start to work towards where they could go. And we can also use it to start understanding how to diversify, understanding if you want to grow a monoculture of corn, where does that fit on this graph versus if
Mm-hmm.
you want to do an intercropping system that also brings back economic diversity? You might not, your gains, economic gain might be lower in the
Mm-hmm.
first 5 years, but over the
Mm-hmm.
long term. So I think, to the point of what we do well, we
Mm-hmm.
communicate graphically, in a way that's legible. We bring together informations from allied experts, and we make it visible and comprehensible to our clients. And in this case, that's our entry point to these landowner conversations is starting to create our new tools, our new sections and plans and diagrams that allow us to enter those conversations.
Yeah, yeah. Can we try to place a corn producer on this diagram? Where will the corn producer be?
Yeah, so the good question, and we'll try to make this, and maybe you could help me. We'll try to make this as illustrative as possible without
Yeah,
having a graphic
yeah.
for the audience. But um, so the top left quadrant is where the highest cases of ecological loss, but also economic gains. I'm calling that the industrialized quadrant.
Yeah.
Um, so you would put a monoculture of corn in that sector, to really show that what your trade-offs are high economic gains for increased ecological loss. Whereas if a landowner was wanting to move towards um, a intercropping system, they would oftentimes, that would move over to the regenerative section, the
Hmm.
top right section.
Yeah.
And in that, you would see that um, there's more ecological gains, but
Hmm.
it, there might be a chance that you have more economic loss. And
Hmm.
I think that's one of the things we need to be quite clear-eyed about
Hmm. Hmm.
in these conversations. Just like when we enter urban communities, I think in the last 10 years, we've gotten really good at understanding we have to kind of enter them with some humility. I think we have to enter these conversations as well with a little bit of humility and clear-eyedness and being upfront about the you might not make as much money off of this in the
Yeah.
near term, but
Mm.
what this is going to do to your, the ecological quality of your land long term, you can start to work with agriculture and forest economists who can actually map that out to you.
Yeah, awesome. So I think that, again, like for our audience, it's nice to check out this graph, this figure. And I think really you can think about any parcel of land and how this parcel can really like fit now, but also what are the different maybe like timely stages of shifting this land to maybe more regenerative or maybe more conservation on the land, but also while, gradually increasing the profit out of this land while increasing the ecological value. So I think it's good to look at all these values at the same time. Thank you so much for having this conversation about your framework. And I think we one of the things that we talked about here was the challenges of landscape architects to enter the space of designing. And like economic is a very big consideration that we need to think about, and how can we enter the space while convincing the farmer or the landowner that long term will actually bring some benefit to you, even if our service and also that maybe the first few years of land transformation will cost you some money, or at least not give you the amount of money that maybe corn was giving to you. What are some other challenges for us to enter the space of designing agriculture?
There's a couple. The first one I want to, mention is probably specific knowledge. The wonderful thing about land-based economies is the people who inhabit them, your uh parents and grandparents on your farm, my parents, grandparents, great grandparents on theirs, they have such land-based knowledge that is literally lifetimes of knowledge of one plot of land.
Yeah,
And coming in as the expert designer, you'll never be able to compete with that
yeah,
knowledge, and you shouldn't try. Um, I think where we come in is we come in understanding that our role is to absorb as much information from locals, from the scientific community, from every discipline that works with rural lands, contractors, surveyors, water commissioners, just everyone with it, and understand how high of a degree of knowledge that they have for the place that they live, and just absorb that information and consolidate that information into a framework for how to move forward on that property and communicate effectively the kind of accumulation of those voices.
Yeah.
So that's what we, I think, just do exceptionally well. And in these rural communities, we can do that. We can do that very well if we don't come in and claim to know more about the land.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
we'll talk about this more as we talk
Yeah.
about allied professionals, but that there is a total dance to doing that. And that's part of the fun of it. That's the sociological aspect of and psychological aspect of entering, new places and treating that curiously and as part of what's actually fascinating about these places and these people is definitely part of it, but it's also the challenge.
So today we're shifting the gears to talk about the intersection of science and design and how design can actually be a very nice tool to translate all this knowledge that all these universities are producing. So my first question for you is, when we talk about science and design, what do you have in your mind about science? Like what kinds of science matter if we want to design the landscape, the agricultural and rural landscape?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, obviously that's regionally and site specific, but I think there's some very basic fundamental that we deal with in the landscape community. And the obvious ones are things like soils and hydrology. The less obvious things might be the different the multitude of uh, scientific practitioners who deal with different issues of biodiversity. Um, so I think, one of our goals often as landscape architects, and particularly as we're dealing with rural communities, our rural lands, is not only how to meet the goals of our clients, but also how we enhance the biodiversity of that land when we do
Yeah.
that, because we know just how much um, ecological services are associated with biodiversity enhancement, and that's one of
Hmm.
our critical issues that we face right now is
Yeah.
biodiversity loss. So, with that being said, each site has its own, interests and issues, and increasingly we deal with different members of the scientific community that can address those issues
Yeah.
of biodiversity. Um, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. How about the other kinds of knowledge? We talked a little bit about the generational knowledge on the land that your grandfather and your dad and you, and like same for me, we accumulated all this knowledge through time. Can we also count it as a science that we really need to consider and think about when we design the landscape?
Yeah, that's a really great point. So it's kind of like science with there's like science with the capital S that we give to,
Yeah,
folks with PhDs, and then there's, kind of that localized knowledge that as you rightfully point out, it has just as much validity, it being considered science. I think that's one of the really fun aspects of this is gathering that knowledge. And it's easy to kind of start playing favorites. You go, oh, like these guys know more than these guys and stuff
yeah,
like that. But I think what it really comes down to is one of our uphill battles as designers is to kind of have people get what we're trying to do.
yeah,
Like, so you'll deal with scientists or clients who all consider enlightened clients or enlightened allies, and these are
yeah,
people who kind of get what you're trying to do, and really what you're trying to do is not think within the silo of people's specific knowledge. So if
Mm-hmm.
you talk to a forester about a plot of land, they are going to come at it with their specific knowledge
Yeah.
and their agenda and the way that they've been hired for 20, 30 years to address a plot of land. Same with an agronomist, same
Mm-hmm.
with someone, the someone who works the land, hired help, stuff like that. So it's really trying to find those people who get it and get that what you're trying to do is think holistically through kind of a bigger systems approach to a land. And when you find those people, those are the people that you like hold on to and you just get very excited to work with them because then they unlock all of the opportunity of their knowledge into the goal that you're trying to create,
Yeah.
um, which
Yeah.
is like that's when it's the most fun. And I think one of the ways of bringing the scientific community into projects, and this is there's creative ways of doing this outside of just, asking your client to pony out a bunch of money to bring in scientists.
Yeah.
Um, but the most important that we can do, not only for our profession's viability in these places, but for our clients as well, is find a way of monitoring and measuring
Mm-hmm.
how our techniques um, actually improve the land.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can't measure these things,
Yeah.
we can't build a case for why it's important,
Yeah.
for people to think this way, think holistically through these problems.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that is why when you deal with things like biodiversity,
Mm.
that is why it's important to have capture a baseline ecological assessment of the land,
Mm-hmm.
so that 5, 10, 20 years down the line,
Mm-hmm.
you're able to track how those land management techniques that you implemented
Mm-hmm.
have changed the land. And we have to be clear-eyed about that too, of understanding, maybe some things aren't working, but we can't know unless we measure that. Now, the question is kind of not every landowner can afford to bring the scientific community
Yeah.
in that way. The wonderful thing is there are a lot of hobbyists in the ecological world, online communities basically who do
Mm-hmm.
some baseline ecological assessments because birders
Yeah.
will come to your land and count the bird. People do that as a hobby, so
Yeah.
that's an option. Another option is the extension agencies are an amazing resource. At ag schools, a lot of times I've been able to work with researchers at land grant colleges who
Mm-hmm.
essentially couldn't take money for their
Yeah.
time because it
Yeah.
becomes part of their research, and they're incentivized to undergo that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there's ways that if we kind of are clever about who we're reaching out to and building relationships and making compelling case for the long-term, impact and aspirations of what we're trying to do on a piece of land, you can
Mm-hmm.
actually get a lot of people to come help with that process.
Yeah, awesome. So maybe like to make things a little bit more clear, let's imagine a scenario where there's a young designer who's not really experienced in designing agricultural landscapes, maybe like a student, but also there is a farmer who has 100 acres of land and never tried to shift from corn, and those two people want to work together to shift this land, but also the designer does not have experience. What are some of your guidelines to make this design challenge happen? Like designing this land to be something more than just corn and soybean.
Sure. Well, I think that's where our toolkit is great, is like kind of all that basic stuff that we do from the beginning. We analyze the geology, the hydrology, the ecology,
Hmm.
soil aspects, migratory wildlife patterns, adjacent ecological resources, and down the line. Those are things that a young designer can knows how to do just through their schooling and through, their time in practice. And they can immediately come in and start to visualize a bigger picture of someone's piece of land that they only know inherently, through first person perspective of being on their land.
Mm-hmm.
So first being able to kind of clearly represent a bigger picture of what's going on
Mm-hmm.
ecologically and programmatically on a piece of land is the first line for us to get in there. Then
Yeah.
I think there is the part that we do well as well is the kind of interview portion of understanding priorities,
Mm-hmm.
understanding limitations, constraints, where we want to get to. And then it's really branching out into the broader region
Mm-hmm.
to try to find best practices.
Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
might not know much about corn, but you're learning as you're going with
Yeah.
your client, learning from them as much as possible, learning from anyone you can, but
Mm-hmm.
then kind of branching out to see where are the best practices. What nonprofits in the region are trying to do something more aligned with maybe a sustainable practice of agriculture. The resources are out there if you kind of look for them and you're willing to make those phone calls and email introductions and
Yeah.
um, yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I'd say is how you get started.
Yeah, so what kind of resources should this young landscape architect look at? And like maybe what kind of maybe like again extension agents or scientists or maybe hobbyists who know about science can this young landscape architect talk to in order to make sure that this plan for this farm transformation really makes sense?
Yeah. Um, I think the extension agency is a great resource. I think as far as the regenerative community might say that they're a little conservative.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that is because they're tied to the research coming out of their schools. And they're really embedded in their community. They can't necessarily, come into a rural community and just like really shake things up and say, hey, everybody should really get on board with the regenerative movement and shift to this way. I think there's, that's not really their prerogative. Their prerogative is to kind of give best practices,
Mm-hmm.
information within kind of a vetted, um, mode of land use practices.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think what you'll find if you get out of land grant or not, sorry, not land grant colleges, if you look to some more nonprofits in the area, um, and just kind of look back the an interesting place to live for us, I think, as designers, is to have these dialogues between industry organizations and
Mm-hmm.
conservation organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to understand that both have their own agenda, and
Mm-hmm.
industry is trying to serve their landowners to maximize profit. Conservation is trying to maximize conservation value of land, which usually doesn't impact the bottom line unless you're someone who is looking to maintain their land on tax incentives. So it's really that in between where you as a designer start to think creatively between the two
Yeah.
and find those enlightened scientists
Yeah.
and practitioners that help you bridge that gap. And usually it's somewhere in between.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree with you.
Yeah. I'll add one thing that I should have probably captured in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But the easiest place to go and probably the most fruitful place to go
Mm-hmm.
is to go back in history.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the things that Nelson Bird Woltz does exceptionally well, and I think
Mm-hmm.
they're exemplary in the profession for, is they go back in time as far as they can and go back to the indigenous people who use that very land and move
Mm-hmm.
forward through subsistence farming
Mm-hmm.
into industrial farming into where we are today. And they really try to understand what played out as far as land use techniques during that
Mm-hmm.
time and what was the impact of them. If you
Yeah.
do that, you really start to get a picture of what worked, what didn't.
Yeah.
And the native ecology of a place will always give you hints to how that land is best managed.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you again, Clay, for joining us. We talked about different things, including your adaptive lands framework that is part of the Rural Futures Collaborative. And then we also talked about your experience and background as a designer who was coming from a farming background and how you turned out to be a designer in rural and agricultural landscapes. Thank you so much for being here, and I really appreciate this conversation. And again, for people who are interested in knowing more about Clay and his work and also the Rural Future Collaborative, please feel free to check our bio for this episode and find out the link for their work. Thank you.
Thanks, Ishraq.
Thank you so much.